to get started, this lecture kind of comes from some material that's associated with my PhD, and so I won't talk about the PhD in depth, but I'll just introduce where I was coming from, because part of the rest of the semester now, in a way, starting from landscape urbanism, follows a trajectory of topics that arise from my PhD and from my research. And roughly the emphasis of them is about the transition from a kind of representational design practice to a built design practice, or a time-based practice. And so last week we talked about landscape urbanism, and this week we're going to talk about what I've called performance, and to just sort of put into consideration how this sort of operates. One of the things that I've sort of arisen from, and this is sort of something you can see in my table of contents, my PhD here, is that I move into my case studies after a discussion of what I call the process discourse. And in a way, it's a bit old now, because I've been working on this for 10 years. And so the process discourse is a term that I coined as a way of describing what was the dominant school of design at the time, internationally, particularly in the design schools that were focused on the idea of generating design via certain sorts of processes modelled on nature, or modelled on models of nature. And so that process discourse, I won't go into this chapter that I had there, but you can see, just in general, you can see that I talk about layering, algorithm, and performance. Now, before I go into my case studies, and you can see that before it, I'm talking about the sort of the life of the gardener and gardening. And so what I'm kind of doing is trying to move between the idea of design as something that is predictive to the idea of design as something that happens in real time. And there's a whole lot of theoretical aspects that come out about that. And a lot of them come up about a claim that I saw and argued with in relationship to the process discourse, as I'm calling it, because a lot of the time those projects were related to the idea that if we represent a process in a design, it's the same as being engaged with the process. And so at that time, the process discourse was very much engaged on simulating rather than doing. And so with that in mind, I'll move on to today's lecture. And so when we're talking about performance, what we're really talking about is a word that has the word form in it, obviously. So the dynamic that I'm interested in is the dynamic between form and process. And as I say, when we get to you might want to see it like this, is that to some extent the process discourse, as I'm calling it, which is the range of designers and theoreticians interested in change and process, were responding to what they were really regarding as a kind of like a formalism in design that was around composition. And if we go back to the lecture on landscape urbanism, we can see that the response of people like Rem Koolhaas, etc., in the La Valette competition using layering techniques was a way of trying to get round the compositionalness of design. Because in a way that compositionalness was associated with modernism and with the sort of totalizing sort of worldview, and also for this generation kind of boring worldview of composition. In a sense, then before you were taught certain compositional principles, and you could be taught to design like Mies van der Rohe. In fact, in the US, thousands of architects were by Mies van der Rohe. And so in a way, a lot of these methods were about trying to find other ways into design, and a lot of them were about utilizing processes, and a lot of those processes were either rhetorically or directly utilizing information from the environment. And so we touched upon this, so I'm going to go through it last week, and I'm going to go through it now. So in the book Landscape Urbanism, Designing the Machinic Landscape, or In the Machinic Landscape by Mostafavi and Najleh, they taught a generation of designers who were really utilizing digital processes overlaid onto sensing or digital methods that were intaking, sensing information. And by that I mean, for example, that through a process of modelling and then inputting information, they were able to start to generate forms that arose through a modelling of movement, really, and through a process. And so here, this idea of movement and of time and process is super important. And so ultimately what we're looking at in a drawing like this is we're looking at an initial process that starts to generate input other information that then affects the design itself. And here's another example of that, where there's a certain sort of process which takes in certain sorts of information and ultimately starts to guide where the design outcome is going to go. Now, to some extent, this is a normal process and one we should be doing, which is to say, when we're designing, when we gather site information, we want to gather it at the point where it's relevant. We want to diagram it so that we can see how it's having an effect on the design. This is a basic thing we'd want to do, and I got zero argument with that. The issue is really that when we start to employ information from another type of input, and then try to bring that information in across media to suddenly regard it as part of architectural form. And so this is where, for example, as I'm talking about, if one maps a sound wave and then makes the building in the shape of the sound wave, is there any longer any relationship between the sound wave and the building? The sound wave is something that is immaterial, something that can be abstractly mapped into a sound wave. And in a way, there is not even any relationship between the mapping of the sound wave and the sound. The sound is itself a totally different thing. To play in the medium of the sound would be to make sound. In the same way that writing music is different to playing music. The writing may guide you in how you play the music, but once the music starts, it's in the medium of the ear and the sound, etc. And so, in a way, this is a bigger question for design, which is the role of representation versus effect. And so you could say another model of this would be, and this is something that happened a lot in the 60s, for example, by people like Lawrence Halpern, as Dirk, who's not here, was talking about the other day in his presentation, which is that, for instance, Halpern and would represent movement on site. Over a certain amount of time would develop information about what the site was like in terms of movement, and therefore perhaps would be able to insert things that would change direction, change speed, change orientation. And so in a way, the things that were designed were not representations, but they were going to have effect on the thing that had been mapped originally. Whereas in these examples, a lot of them are mappings that are then concretized into design form. Now, again, I don't actually have a problem with this at all, essentially. It's when the claim is made that somehow that makes a design closer to the property that it's mapping. So is a design that's generated from movement better than a design that is not generated from movement if both of them are essentially operating in the same way? And so I've got no problem how anybody generates design, but I do have an issue with the claim that might be made that because my design looks like a sound wave, it is about sound. It could be a really great design generated from a sound wave. And so so that after having established that claim, this then opens up this idea about whether representation or drawing can ever get us any closer to real change. Because my argument, and the one that's going to go right the way through, is real change can't be simulated. Real change is in time. And that's what we're going to go through the rest of this class. You know, we might be able to predict a certain range of things, but the classic would be the coin toss. We can start to develop probabilities about whether a coin toss will come up heads and tails by monitoring all coin tosses. But you're still not going to guarantee that when you toss the coin, you're going to get head or tails. So that's an important concept when we think about what we do as designers, right? It's where a whole lot of terms come up, particularly terms like contingency, which is we might design it to be for A, but it's got a backup which is B, C, D, E, and F, for example, because we can't ever have the certainty. Similarly, when we model to people the idea of people's behaviour, people are going to do this. it's worth thinking about your sense of your wiliness. Perhaps model yourself in your mind as a teenager when your parents told you you're going to do this and bugger you. I'm not going to do that. So when we think about the idea of program and the idea that it's just automatic, we should think about that there's some individual in there who might not like being a ball in a pinball machine splattered around the place, So that was part of this was also this interesting point for me personally, where I had been very much a kind of digital guy and had moved into being, rejecting the digital and moving into other things. And so in my PhD, I was in a way critical of the role that the digital was having, because what I was saying was that it was giving people an over-elevated sense of control of the world in their representations that was not the same as what the world was actually like. Whereas landscape architecture and gardening, because they were grounded in materials that change, were tied with what the world was really like. And so I was proposing, and have been, that that's a good model for a whole lot of other things, including urbanism. And so there's also this thing where I was in that chapter, I also talked about the idea that, and there's been a lot of digital, and I've been interested in it because, as I said, I was a digital guy originally. But you'll see here that there's a term here that is called morphogenesis. Now, morphogenesis literally means what it's saying. It says morpho means form. And so like when you say morphology of plants, that's their form, the ology of their form. And genesis is like genesis, it's how it's made. So morphogenesis means how something's made. And it's a term that comes originally from biology. And it gets stronger and stronger in relationship to, for instance, genetics. Because in genetics, we have this thing where the genetic code both has a level of continuity within it, but also allows individual variation. It then takes in through reproduction, it then takes in more information and modifies, And so one thing that I was interested in is you can see that here, this is the caption from this project by Occupancy. A surface was generated through digital morphogenesis using an evolutionary process of local manipulations shown over 5 iterations. And so what we're talking about when we're talking about morphogenesis and evolution is the idea that a piece of geometry can change over time. And so this is where ultimately, and the idea of iteration is in a way an evolutionary cycle, or what's known as a kind of recursive cycle. And so, these are a series, here's the initial thing, and over these 5 genetic changes, it changes to this. Now, calling it digital morphogenesis should make our ears prick up, because what it's actually trying to do is to tie the computer to a natural process or a natural analogy. And so this is something the process discourse was doing, which was, if we consider what Koolhaas and people were doing in the 80s around mapping things, it was kind of much closer to an art process. And by now, through collage and digital processes becoming automated in the computer, it had been what I call naturalized, to the point where the digital had been naturalized. Now, ironically, this is not a conversation that you really need to have at this school, because basically Matteo and I are the only 2 digital guys here. But other schools in the world are heavily driven by this sort of thing, although it's tapering off a little bit. And so my claim was that this is fine to talk about this as evolutionary, and we could talk about, you can design codes these days that have evolutionary characteristics, and this is what's happening with algorithms these days. And obviously people are getting worried about this because this is an artificial intelligence, and there's some machine learning is what it's known as. But is that alive? This is actually a representation of an algorithm, ultimately. This is really not even what it is. It's not like someone's built this. This is actually a graphic representation of an algorithm where the algorithm changes over time. So I was really making a claim and arguing in my PhD about whether we can start to really use natural metaphors to this. And if we start talking about, for instance, real growing things, do these claims in architecture about morphogenesis, evolution, growth, are they true? And so I ultimately looked at the only ones that I argued are really true if one wants to take this, which is that, for example, here is a group from University of the Cronin group at the University of Glasgow, and what they're actually working on is self-assembling chemical buildings, so building materials that self-assemble into things. And so for me, the reason why this is more relevant than this is that this is actually what's known as a post-factum documentation. In a way, this is a capture of a process, and so is this, but in a way, this process that these things are on is assembling themselves via chemical relations. And so there's actually quite a lot of work going on about what's known as Proto Architecture, architecture that assembles itself. There's a lot of talk internationally about nano and robotic architecture. And so this is when we're moving from the stuff that was happening 15 and 20 years ago, when we were interested in working with simulations, to now when it's changed to the point where people are now working directly with time. We're working directly with things that will have an effect. And then moving to the next, this is sort of an overview slightly of where we're going, but I was also in a way arguing in that chapter that when we're talking about performance as a model or response to the process discourse as something I was more interested in, what we really should be working with is the annotation or the orchestration of processes over time. And so, for example, here is the launch of Parc La Villette with a fireworks show, and there is, down here, is the resulting fireworks activations and timeline that they use to try to develop this. And so Schumi developed this as an idea of the park's display in the sky, and that was then broken down into a series of actions. And so in a way, the interest, probably what I was arguing was that using these kind of media, which are about time-based activities and linear things where one follows the other, was a closer way of working with time, because ultimately it was a cue that was happening in real time to activities. At the same time, my key thing was, if you're just trying to make things turn out directly how you intended them to as a designer, you're missing a key property of time, which is now novelty arising, which is difference arising over time, and we'll talk more about that. And so that's sort of where I was sort of coming from in that particular chapter of my PhD. And now what I want to talk about is where I've gone to with it and how that works in relationship to this idea of performance. And so maybe what I'll do is I'll quickly go through this set of definitions that were also from my PhD in my final chapter. So which is saying to say, change is where something becomes different. And so thereby, that's a key thing, because I would have argued therefore that this Schumi thing is not really about change, because he knows what it's going to look like. So it's not becoming different. It's just a process of ensuring that he gets what he wants. And so for me, change is a process of becoming different, and there are three implied parameters in that process: the becoming, or process, which is the process of becoming something; the result, which is the difference between one state and the next state; and time, the context of the process's action. And so there's an interesting point here, and this comes to this idea of what form is. So when we talk about form, we're talking about what Gregory Bateson termed as duration, which is how long is something going to last, or the medium of it. Now, the thing about time is that this idea, I argue basically that contemporary thinking focuses more on time than on change. And the way that is, and I think that's an English thing, and so the way I'll explain it is like this: time is a medium. Time is a continuous medium in which things happen. It's like focusing on the clock versus focusing on the time on the clock. If we need the clock to be able to keep one moment relative to the next, to know that 3 o'clock and 3:15 are different. But in Western thought, more often we focus on that process of the clock and its time than on the moment where the time occurs. We're so focused on the framework of time that we're less focused on what arises in time. And I mean, it's a convenience, but when we say we were late because something happened in time that interfered with our sense of clock time. We had a little event, might have been traffic, Might have been a decision to have an extra coffee. It might have been to pressing the snooze an extra time. But when we describe that, we don't describe it in terms of time. We describe it in terms of an event. An event interfered with my time because time is ideal and an event is something that happens to us bodily. And so working with change, I say change is where something becomes different. And so form is an interesting thing because when one becomes interested in process, one inherently ends up sacrificing form. And the most common example of that would be that people will say things in the process discourse would say things like a form, that this process created this form. And if I want to change the form, I change the process. And therefore, all the form is, in a way, is a representation of the process. And so, because in a way, what happens is that the process's result is, in a way, its end. It's this particular moment. And so people tend to not like form because it suggests that processes have an end. And that's because of this idea of time and what's known as telos or intentionality. So this is where we go to a religious thing, which is to say that in science and in process, the idea of time would suggest that nothing is predetermined. Everything arises through somewhat random processes. And so to talk about something in terms of an end is to imply predefinition and a definitive endpoint. So in this section, what I'm talking about is the ways of dislodging and changing ideas about end. And another one, and the clearest one, is to speak about the term result. And when we talk about the word result, is what we're implying there was something happening before. So the term result always implies that a form has resulted from a process, whereas end has a certain finality with it. And so this is where these are kind of key terms around thinking about change. Another way, moving from this idea of end as a definitive endpoint and result as something that alludes to a moment in a process, is something which you could call iteration. And this is a kind of common term. Iteration refers to something being a moment in a process of change. And so, for instance, that water level is an iteration because when I do this, the level is different. I'll do it again. The level is different again. Each one of those was an iteration. And what we're looking at when we look at this is a feedback process, essentially, a recursive process, because each time the amount of empty space gets smaller because the empty space is getting larger as I'm drinking more out of it. So there's a dynamic between those two. And so iteration means that over time this bottle will end up empty, even though the bottle has remained the same. And so iteration is a common term, but a lot of the time these cyberneticians who are interested in this prefer this idea of recursiveness. And it's really about the idea of the feedback returning back to the input of a system. So then we go on to another term for form, which is an interesting one. So iteration assumes, yes, it's a form, but it's only one moment because another iteration is coming and another one is coming and another one is coming. The next one would be provisional, which means that something is currently existing but potentially being changed later. And so in other words, this moment, this iteration is provisional on a series of other circumstances. In a way, it's slightly predictive, but it's provisional because we're accepting that it's in a process of constant change. Whereas in iteration, we measure an iteration as it is. We might not measure something's provisional because it's on its way to becoming something else. And the final one I talk about is related to provisional, and the term is contingent. And contingent basically means that it's existing under current circumstances and subject to change, and it's contingent on those circumstances. So provisional and contingent have a relationship with them, but in a way contingent is also something that is predictive because it may or may not happen. The provisional has happened because it's in transition. Contingent is still predictive, but it's part of a continuum. Now the reason this comes to this point is a really interesting point, and I'll explain why I've ended up here. It's a strange kind of weird fixation of mine. So in the process discourse, a lot of the time people were arguing against form. And so what they were arguing was that form is about formalism. Form is in a way autonomous of processes. Form is about ego. Form is not scientific. Form is in a way, it became for a few years there a dirty word. Depends in which school you're in, but certainly internationally. And so, but at the same time, when I was studying, landscape architecture is always a bit late for everything. And so in landscape architecture, just before this process discourse took over, landscape architecture had finally rediscovered form after having spent 40 years in Ian McCarg ecological space, and it finally had rediscovered form by looking at modernist landscape architecture. And no sooner had it discovered form from modernism, like James Rose, like Garrett Ekbo and these guys, suddenly everyone's decided that form is a dirty word. And so I was really interested in why do we have to polarize between form and process? Why do we have to say, I'm interested in process and therefore form doesn't matter? Instead, it's sort of how we position what the form is. It's a really important idea and something we alluded to last week. Remember the stick in the sand, right? Yeah. The stick in the sand. So the stick in the sand is still about the stick. So you can't cut out form. You can't say it's not about form because there's not ball in the sand. The ball in the sand would do something completely different. And so there's still a form in this process. Why must we say I'm either interested in process and the stick doesn't matter because it's only about the dune that arises? We have to imagine that if we're going to work catalytically, that we're working in time intervals where form will have presence for a long time as well as its effect. And so we can't refuse to afford to polarize them. Now, this guy Sanford Quinter was really important to the discourse of the form of the process discourse in talking about form. And this book, Architectures of Time, is an amazing book about how it says towards a theory of the event in modernist culture. And so one of the things that Quinter talks about is the work of this sculptor and painter called Umberto Boccioni. Now, Boccioni was one of the futurists, and I don't know if you guys know about the futurists, but the futurists were an multidisciplinary arts movement in the basically early 1900s, latently kind of fascist, but the main contribution they made is they were completely mad about technology and the idea that the car was demonstrating an acceleration of culture, an acceleration of time, that things were going to happen really quickly and that we should embrace this new world of speed, particularly. And so Boccioni, and this is Boccioni here, was one of the artists who was involved in this movement, and in his artworks, like these ones here, what he was doing was something that the Cubists would later do, which is that in a way he's showing this object where he's exaggerating the dynamism of the form in time. And so essentially what he's doing is he's trying to both capture the object as an object and also with the object the kind of moments of transformation. Now it's a kind of overly sort of muscularized sort of figure and sort of whatever, but at the same time you get that sense that even though this is a leg, the leg's movement is up, it's sort of running in its process, and that this sort of, for example, other objects are also transforming in time. And over here we start to see the influence that Boccioni might have had on Cubism, where we're looking at multiple viewpoints, which also is about time. Why would, for example, Quinter's book be called an interest in a theory of the event in modernism? It's because, in a way, that the acceleration of the car brings the viewer and subject into a frame of time, which then involves the viewer as a subject with subjectivity and perception. And so, in a way, this is where the event is something where we can say, as compared to a form, an event is something that happens in time. And so there was a lot of theorization in this period, such as Henri Foncellon, The Life of Forms in Art, with this interest in dynamism. But one of the things that Quinter talks about, which is quite interesting, is the idea of form and performance, which is that 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 form is form, but it is actually in a kind of a transformative state of performance, and that there is an activity occurring in relationship to the form, that the form is both catalytic to and resulting from. Catalytic to, causing, resulting from, itself changing. And so that process of influencing and being changed is a key idea to any discussion about performance. And it changes things because of the fact, and most of the time when people use the word performance, they're not talking about form, they're talking about performance as event. Whereas what's interesting is that Quinter still argues that good designers and artists who were interested in process were interested in form because they saw within form its chrysalis as influencing something else. And so that, even the greatest formalists were actually performance people. They were interested in form. Now, this process, this is a kind of interlude, but it was important for me in my writing because to some extent if you use a term like, if you use space if you have embedded naturally a kind of concept of space, which is to say, I'm sitting in a space, I'm contained, I'm in an interior, I'm going to use a wall, I'm changing a space, then we're always interested in form. You can't be interested in form without being interested in space, because our ideas of space come from modernism and form. People who are really interested in process won't be interested in space because they'll say space is a modernist thing related to form. And it is, because in the 19th century there was no space. Space as a concept comes from modernism. Now, so how do you talk about form? Well, we have to find a way to put together form and space with process, and that's been my big thing, not one or the other. Now, obviously, this is where if we started off at the beginning talking here about this sort of stuff and my reflections on the process discourse, I'm in a kind of interesting position now because of the fact that, and I've actually got this the wrong way around, kind of, the fact that these days some of the most interesting urbanism, and this is not to say this is it, but is happening around parametric urbanism. And it looks kind of very Zaha. In fact, this is Zaha. But prior to this, I was very interested in the work of this guy. Now, I wonder if I'm going to have... No, gosh. No, nothing in there. Nothing to see in there, folks. So this book here, Local Codes by Michael Sorkin, which I've talked about. If people have done ACD with me, they'll know about this book. But interestingly, when I was a student, this book came out, and I was really impressed with it because it approached, you'll see it says Local Code, the construction of a city at 42 degrees north latitude. And what it was doing was it was designing a city via a series of rules. And so essentially it was using a planning code to come up with a city. Now, what's different about that than design? What's different about that is that form becomes, in a way, contingent. Things happen on the basis of how the code responds to what arises. And so, ironically, you're in the weird situation where planning is more in touch with time than design is, but at the same time, we want to see design visually, things change with our eyes, but planning is better at dealing with time than, and even when it does it badly, than architecture and design. And what was nice is that in this book, Sorkin set up a series of these rules and terminologies to produce a city. And so you can see he has principles, he's got a Bill of Rights, he talks about steady states, he talks about key principles about views and vectors, and then he comes up with the words you can tell they're kind of design words, so mosaic, blue, green, nabe, nets, gates, places, centres, edges, archipelago, satellites, the garland, hab, and all of these terms where he never defines what they are. He lets you as a reader know that hab probably means houses because it's like habitation. Blue probably means water. Green probably means trees. But he never really tells you what they are. He just defines how they act on each other and how they influence each other. And so, Sorkin's code was really something that I was interested in for a long time because I'm very interested in how do you work in time. And rule-based scenarios are one very clear way of working in time, and particularly for designers like architects, landscape architects, planners, to be able to have any sense of forming the city where one is interacting with private property, which is something I say over and over again. We only have limited agency over other people's site. We're always employed by somebody. So how do you have influence on a city when you might not be actually being paid by the owner of this site to do anything? What you have to move up to is into a meta level where one starts to think about operating in the realm of rules and using rules to come up with the kind of effects that you want, but also hopefully to allow for serendipity and novelty and fun, interesting new things to come out of those rules. And so examples of this type of approach, for example, here is Melbourne, where I spent a long time. And in Melbourne, it has this 19th century urban structure with these really tight sort of laneways. And I was involved, not in Melbourne, but in Brisbane, in setting up laneway guidelines. And so I got to look at a lot of Melbourne's guidelines. And it has a series of these lanes. It's got 200 and something of these laneways, And so basically the argument, and there's so many of these little laneways in the city. And so the argument and the worry of the city was that they're going to lose that laneway character because of the fact that they are trying to densify the city. And because they're worried about the fact that, essentially Melbourne was originally an 8-storey height limit city up until 1950-something. And so once that went, all the skyscrapers started to come up. Now, if everything became skyscraper, then the space of that the city was really well known for, which is kind of like this kind of height and a bit higher, would disappear into a huge gap between buildings, etc. And so what they did was that they developed a series of policies to try to work with these lanes and categorising them into different stages. And then they developed a series of these guidelines that specify what will happen under different sorts of circumstance. Where, buildings have a 35-metre height limit with a 7-metre opening, and after that, if the building gets taller, it steps back by 7 metres so that people on the ground will not see the building at certain sorts of heights. They'll have an open view at these things. They'll have sight lines, etc., so that effectively they're in the space of the interior of the laneway. And this is also because, they wanted to make the city denser in terms of housing and infrastructure provision. Now, essentially, that is a parametric code. So that is a rule where we can say, we could say something like, if Z is greater than 35, then offset X 7. Repeat. And then what happens is we basically find we get that shape of the skyscraper. Now, this is a very rational rule. We could actually choose to, as Sorkin was doing, create much more irrational rules and come up with, things for the TOC or boroughs. And so in a way, rule-based design allows us to respond to circumstances. Now in the parametric, and this is an interesting thing, that's what's happened to this, is that, this is a master plan by Patrick Schumacher working at Zaha Hadid's office. And, I want you to forget any hatred or dislike one might have of this kind of geometry. And let's talk about it for a second. Because interestingly, it's a highly conservative piece of urban design. And so it does some very basic things. So if we look at it, here is the main sort of rules. Here's the Greenfield site. Find logical connections between each street across to the edge of the sides opposite. Now that's conventional urban design, which favours connectivity. That's something which comes out, for instance, space syntax, which is about as few levels of deepness as possible. So that's best practice urbanism. And then after that, what it does is it breaks these up according to the creation of squares at corners And so what it's therefore doing is that it's actually, in this zone, for example, in here, what it's doing is something that comes from Cerdà's master plan in Barcelona from the 1890s. So it's creating spaces at corners, etc. It's also doing a thing from Aldo Rossi where, for example, it's got areas which are about housing typology, and then it's got areas which are about infrastructure spines or armatures. And it's some of its typologies, for example, these ones here, these are essentially perimeter blocks, which are the standard for medium or high density housing that also has private space associated with it and then creates a fine urban grain. As well as that, it acknowledges certain sight lines, and so it's got things about how it has a relationship to the existing fabric, so it's got a gradient that it's using between this side and that side, and then after that it's got a kind of a higher and denser CBD area. Now, if I'd not shown you any of that, I could have described that and drawn that in a way that was like a completely conventional piece of urban design. All that the parametric software Grasshopper does is it doesn't care about the geometric norms that we might have associated with those typologies. And it's resulted in these forms. And so what's interesting is that this process here and this process here is being able to be visualized and organized and manipulated parametric through software, whereas previously it was done through planning code, for example. So these parametric tools are an interface between planning code in a textual sense and design visualization, and that's the reason why I'm interested in them. And so I include them here because of their relationship to rule-based things. Now, if we move to performance and my idea about performance and what I've been discussing, a key aspect of performance is the idea of things happening in real time. Now, while this is simulated, in these examples here, the codes are actually contingent. They are arising from being triggered, is the term people use. They're triggered by something. For instance, certain floor area ratios or bulk are triggered when developers start to work on certain sites. They're already latent waiting there for activity. And similarly, interestingly, this idea of working with code has been really important to one of the most interesting performative projects in a long time, which is this work in New York City by the Department of Transport under the management of Jeanette Sadiq-Khan. And in this book, Street Fight, she talks about what she did to allow for things to emerge in the city, and most of it was around changing traffic codes. And so traffic codes, and this is something that I've got one of my urban infrastructure students who's doing their masters with me is working on. A lot of the time, codes, safety codes particularly, interfere with what you can do. And so things about traffic volumes, things about speeds, things about the relationship of different types of road users like bikes, people, cars, etc. And so ultimately, Sadiq Khan really had to take on some of the uses of the street and the different users, and she had to do it in relationship to a policy and code-based framework to reprogram these spaces. And so, essentially she's not the designer of any of these projects. What she was, though, was that she was the facilitator of changes of policy that could allow the project to happen. Now, ultimately, and it's a weird thing to say, is we spend so much of our time valorizing designers, but no designer could have done this if there hadn't been a client who understood that policy was affecting what the outcome of designers' work was going to be. Design always works within a framework that's given to it. This is where I think we spend so much of our time trying to make designers. We should be spending more of our time trying to make clients, because clients will ultimately be the people who make anything happen, because they'll be facing huge internal ways that things have always been done to try to make change, etc. And so I hope that this is something you remember if any of you guys ever become clients, which is a very important thing to do. And so in these processes, what she was doing was she was changing and repurposing spaces, but mostly what she did was she created temporary interventions. This work was going from about 2007 to 2013. And so essentially what she's doing is creating tests. So she could say to her colleagues in the Department of Transport, yes, you're going to lose X many parking spaces. Yes, you're going to have to change the speeds of your vehicles. Yes, you're going to lose throughput, etc. But at the same time, we can do a test. There's not going to be any harm in us doing a test on these days, monitoring it and evaluating it. And the ability to do that means that she has to be in the time of her project or her place. As designers, we're mostly in anticipation and then we're gone. And so this is where the client, and only the client, can really be part of the process of things ongoing. And so, some of these became, quite significant and quite radical sort of tests and changes. And then some of them have become really big projects, such as, Snowhetter's work that's been going on in Times Square, a lot of which started as temporary interventions, such as using materials just like paint, etc. And so this is where something that comes up, I don't know how many of you guys went to the talk about the foreshore recently, but, one of the arguments that the lecturer was making there was around how no amount of traffic, additional traffic infrastructure is going to solve a traffic problem, basically. We know this, right? We know that putting it'll make it easier for people who live in the Sea Point and onwards to be able to drive to Durbanville. But other than that, for everybody else, all of the additional works that might happen from finishing the elevated freeway is just going to bring more cars into the city. So first of all, you would need to do these changes. One needs a philosophical approach to the fact that one has to argue with bodies of knowledge. And then after that, one needs a kind of what's known as a tactical approach to be able to deal with the issues that arise. Last week, we looked at the work by DL Landscape Architects in New York, the sponge parks and the Gowanus reservoirs, etc. And those projects were, first of all, based around taking a tactical reading of all the various authorities' requirements on site. In other words, that the Corps of Engineers needs a water level height of this, and the sewerage department needs this. And the tactical thing, or the strategic and tactical thing, is doing little fixes. The tactical thing is doing little fixes for each of those people with the larger strategic view of doing something. Now, a lot of the time, the main thing that happens in practice is that you get confronted by the fact that you're the sort of horrifying normality of the world. And part of that is that these small things can overwhelm a project. And so the ability to have an overarching framework that allows you to make tactical decisions is really important. And that's what Sadiq Khan had in New York City. Now, if we move on here, it's important to think about and acknowledge that as soon as one's talking about things like the idea that something is provisional or in process, there is always inherently an observer. And so being interested in the process is ultimately being interested in the real time, in the fact that there is a participant observer all the time. You can't talk about time really abstractly in a meaningful way. You have to talk about it in relationship to the person. And so one of the philosophers I looked at in my research was Henri Bergson. And Bergson was translated or had a book written about him by Gilles Deleuze, which I used extensively. And really, for me, it was really important. And here's the sort of these things the sort of key idea of his, which is that this difference between the relationship between perception or between memory and perception, which is to say that, as he says, perception distinguishes three processes: pure memory, memory image, and perception, of which no one in fact occurs apart from the others. Perception is never a mere contact with the mind, with the object present. It is impregnated with memory images, which complete it as they are interpreting it. The memory image in turn partakes in pure memory, which it begins to interiorize it, and of the perception in which it tends to embody itself. And so, in a way, the point of experience is this moment here of perception. And what happens is that then our previous histories begin to intervene into the interpretation of that moment. And so this is where phenomenology, in a way, is trying to pretend that you're only up here in this very, very moment. But in actual fact, we're always informed by the past in some way to understand the present. And so this relationship is quite important because it puts the subject, in the now. And my argument is that one thing that we share with the moment is we share that with living things like plants, for example. And we share that with growth processes and other organisms. And in a way, you can talk about memory in relationship to things like DNA, etc. So where does this operate? Now, this is where one of the things that Bergson talks about is this idea about difference by degree versus difference in kind. So he would say that real change is actually in kind and not in degree. And the way to explain this is to say that the terms of reference of something change with the something. As time passes and as new things emerge, we can't just keep on, in a way, if we're using the previous to govern it, then what we're doing is we're actually making it differences by degree. We're saying it's a bit similar to what came before. It's just a minor modification of the previous. And in that sense, we're never able to deal with the new because all we're doing is actually setting it up in the relationship to the past. Instead, what we should be pursuing, which may be impossible, is to think about things in terms of differences in kind, which is that as something occurs, it is brand new. It gets assimilated into this process, but at that moment there, it is brand new. And for design, this is an interesting point because if we think, I'll use something I'm very familiar with. Let's use an architectural thing. Let's use a post-occupancy evaluation of a building undertaken 2 years after it's constructed. Now, one approach to the post-occupancy evaluation might be to think of it as extended snags, which is to say, here is my vision of the project. The site has been adulterated by these damn users who've come and ripped out my such and such. And therefore, I want to return it to what it was. In other words, it's by degrees changed from what it was. The other one to say is, I'm now going to treat the site as if I've just walked into it. How is it functioning? What is it? Has something emerged that's new? Can I work with what's emerged? And for me, that's to work with differences in kind. As we actually bring in those, as we engage with those new things, we're treating them truly as new and reacting to them. And it's something that's easier to do in landscape than architecture. So I've just ripped off people's diagrams online that say roughly what I want them to say. So whoever that was, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that if you ever watched this video. I'm going to talk about two things because what I'm doing here is I'm also moving towards the social. Because when we're talking here and this page here, we're in a way talking about form, code, policy, and certainly Kahn was interested in the social and people here. The mechanisms she was having to use were around transport. So ultimately she was using that mechanism that was the block to unblock the situation. But now I'm moving towards a more social position away from these kind of existential questions about the past, the future, the present, etc. And so Hannah Arendt is one of my most interesting, she's for me one of the most interesting people. I discovered her via Kenneth Frampton and his writing from her, about her. And so she really talks about, in this book, which is around this, the Roman idea of the vita activa, which is the active life, the three types of living in the active life. And they were, she called them work, actually, but it's labour, work and action is the term. So it says making there, but she called it work, but anyway. And so what's interesting about these is that they're, in a way, all of them, when she talks about the public life, she's talking about living in real time. And the somewhat experience of it. She was a student of Heidegger's, you know. So when she talks about labour, she's talking about the body, which is to say that when someone goes into labour, when she talked about this term that was used at the time called the animal laborans, and because in that time, we have to remember that when real democracy arose in that period, there were still slaves, there was still enslavement of women, there was still, it was a very, in the terms, we wouldn't regard democracy as what it is now. To be involved in democracy, you had to be a citizen. To be a citizen, you had to not be a slave. You weren't essentially regarded as being alive unless you were a citizen. So this is where, for Labour, they're talking about this as the domestic zone. She was talking about this as the domestic zone because in the home you do whatever you have to do to survive, and a lot of what you're doing is about survival. And so this is a kind of, in a way, when people talk about in South Africa, and they're right to talk about the fact that people don't have enough dignity, what they're often referring to is the fact that people can't get beyond this zone of labour where all they're doing is trying to find enough to eat, trying to deal with the day-to-day situations. They are not necessarily able to transcend and move into a space that's outside of those. They are bound by what they're living in, and that zone is the zone of nature. So if you're just feeding yourself, you don't own things. It's a situation that we know here. Now, interestingly, she referred this in a more philosophical sense of this is the zone of the body, where we feed the body, and over the time, all that happens is the body gets old and dies. We don't actually get value out of feeding the body apart from survival and constant degradation of it. It's like a sad, sad thing. And so we know it's true. Like we stay alive to get old. Anyway, it's got some good stuff in between. I can really recommend it to you. But and so based on that desire, therefore, this zone of work she talks about is this zone of making, because in a way what it's about is to try to find things that are durable. They're things that will withstand that process. We make objects, we make architecture, we do these things because we want to make something that withstands the processes that we're subject to. What's my legacy going to be? What's for future generations? We're fixated in time on the future because we're so trapped in the immediacy of labour and living. And so for her, this process that she actually called work and they call making here is, in a way, it's a selfish process, so that when the crafts person makes something and they make an object, they're actually in a selfish arrangement with them and the object to try to create something which withstands the forces that they're subject to. Because for her, the ultimate thing was what she called action, which is more similar to labour than it is to making. And so in action, what she's talking about is this idea that the most interesting things about people is not what they make, it's the actions that they collectively do together. And so here she's talking about this idea that, for example, that if you look at the histories of the world, a lot of them come down to things like a conversation. It might be that a war started because, we look at things that in the history of South Africa, there's so many examples where an event triggered something. We think about the Soweto uprisings. An event triggered something which ultimately triggered a worldwide attention to apartheid, which ultimately contributed to the end of apartheid, for example. And so that was an event. That was, when you go to the apartheid, to the museum in Soweto and you see the famous photo of the boy being carried dead in his arms, that was a photo of a moment, but that moment that was captured was broadcast around the world and changed things, right? But it's not concrete, it's not a piece of architecture, it's not something that's going to last forever, it's not an object, it's not a monument. And so what she was saying is that this point of action and this thing about the relationship between people is the most important thing, but it's actually very similar to this because of the fact that labour, because it is also ephemeral. When you read oral histories or you read things like the Iliad or any of the sort of Greek big stories, a lot of them are actually capturing interactions between gods, a conversation. When we read literature, when we watch a movie, think about the effects that those has. We've all probably got conversations we might have had with a loved one where we think, maybe you had a conversation with somebody where you broke up after it. Maybe something, you can often think of an event that changed everything, right? And so we can see that that's super important. But ultimately, what's in the relationship? And I think this is an important caution and something that when we go on to Lefebvre is really important to talk about here as well. So don't forget, we're in a dynamic here where we started, I've gone a long way around, but let's look at where we started here by talking about form and performance. We're talking about what is the relationship of form to the kind of continuum that people are in. They're in it's a relationship of form, a performance as an activity, right? Now we're moving into performance as an activity that people undertake. And, Lefebvre in his book, The Production of Space, and I haven't read it for a long time, and so I also ripped off this diagram off the internet to remind myself, he's got these three types of spaces. Socio-physical material space. And so this is, which is the sort of concrete space, the perceived space, and so this is in a way, spatial practice. This is where, architecture operates, but instead what he's actually talking about is really the fact that there are these other social spaces that we operate within, and that architecture, for instance, conditions, where architecture as a material is only a very, very limited part of what they are. And so this is a really important kind of idea because, social space as experienced, physically, emotionally, the lived space of relations between users. And so it's a bit similar in these three things. We can see here also Bergson's conception of the space of the mental image of representation, the space of storage, or the mental image, the space of representation, and the space of perception. Now, I go back to this because once we move into this kind of zone, it's interesting in the social here, if we move away from space as an abstract thing that's occupied, etc., and all of these, I should add, all of these models of urbanism have within them the observer, and they have within them the subject, always. And this is something which we can't escape and we should actually own, which is that every time we talk about a streetscape and every time you draw a perspective, there is a viewer implied. We may be looking at it, but we're implying, just by drawing perspective, that there is a viewer. There's somebody looking at that situation. So the viewer is always implied, and a real value of thinking of space in a more social way is to start to ask questions about who is the viewer. And this is something that, with discussions around intersectionality, that I've come across since I've been in South Africa, and also with emerging ideas about differences in gender, we can't anymore trust that the viewer and the subject is the same as design has previously projected it. And so one has to ask the question, what changes in the perspective if the viewer, the implied viewer, is different? And so, now I'm going to sort of step into one of my favourite projects that's a kind of performance project that I wanted to talk about, because it balances a whole lot of different types of ways of thinking about design. And so we talked a little while ago about the work of Design for London in London on the East London Green Grid in relationship to ideas about green infrastructure. And so I think having a performative idea about design means understanding the larger and surrounding contexts of design. It means knowing that the influence that those contexts are going to have on your design. And so in this situation, the projects that we're talking about are sort of situated within the policy framework of the East London Green Grid. And this is a woman called Liza Fior. And Liza, together with Joe Gibbons, who was here last year, she spoke and was our external examiner in landscape last year. Joe Gibbons and she and Liza Fior were involved in a series of projects that were in East London, not in the Olympics, but in the space leading up to the Olympics, that represent a different type of practice of architecture and landscape. And so I met her in this place called Hackney Wick. And Hackney Wick is a suburb on the railway line out to the Olympic site. And the work that Joe Gibbons and Liza Fior were doing was activated by the fact that they were in corridors that were identified as deficient in the mapping of the East London Green Grid by mapping distances of 400 metres in relationship to residential areas, which gave one rationale. And also they were in the view shed of the Olympic site from the train. And so ultimately what they did is they were able to milk a whole lot of bits of funding from different types of projects or from different funding regimes tied to different strategic objectives to identify and produce a series of projects that actually were sort of subversive. And so what's interesting to me about their work, and you can see it here, is that in a way their work was largely about these small interventions that have come to be known as tactical urbanism, which is in a way the idea of tactics coming from tactics and strategy, which the military theorist Clausewitz also used this discrimination where strategy has an overall approach, but ultimately war is fought tactically, which is to say on the ground in relationship to situations. And so similarly, this design for Hackney Wick, rather than being here is my site envelope completely, comprised a series of small interventions into the existing to change the way it functioned. Now, if we go back to the sick and the stand analogy, these are very much stick-based things that are about changing that situation. And so on the one hand, they're also interested in the typology of the street. And so in Hackney Wick, for example, here is some public housing, and what Liza and team did was, for example, they deliberately tried to allow for some separation happening between that housing for security reasons, but they left it completely transparent, and they figured it so that it looked like curtains. So they played with the idea of it being a domestic space, and the fact that people are living in a domestic space, using making a seat edge and domesticating this landscape. At the same time, they kept it being a street, and they upgraded it, and then they started to insert elements within the street that allowed for the street to both be temporarily closed off, so they didn't force the client to have to cop a larger thing, but they started a process that could result in closing, for example. And as you move forward, when they terminated the street, all they did, for example, was put these two chairs that they bolted to the ground across the street as a way of sort of saying you are now entering a space of recreation, or a space of sitting, an everyday space. And all of the materials that they utilised, and here we go, small tweakings of adjacent uses, etc. But all the materials and all the things they were doing were really small tactical things that were having an effect on that area. You can see here this sign from Hackney that says Hackney Wick, so that it's lit up so that when you're catching a train to the Olympic site, you can see Hackney Wick, and so it's also allowing the site to become visible from another sort of system. But as a suite, each one of these is focused on the social in some way, focused on the community in some sort of way. And this is an area which is definitely going through gentrification, but there's also a lot of measures that Liza was able to undertake in the area. Now, one of the projects that they did, which was most impressive to me, was this one, which was their work for this thing called Making Space in Dalston, and so which is from 2009. And so you can see if Gillette Square was working between 2007 and 2013. This is the period where pop-up was happening, which is now almost a historic movement. And the nice thing about this scheme they did was if you look here, you can see that their strategies were quite simple, which were value what is there, nurture the possible, and define what is missing. This is a really simple approach. And so the first thing about it is to really to understand and appreciate and utilize what's already there. So you don't start by having this idea of the project as the field of dreams. I'm going to drop this in and change everything. You have a really strong understanding about what's already there. Nurture the possible, which is to say that there might be latent things that are already happening. There might be possibilities. Possibilities assume that there is something already there, and then determine what is missing to fix up. So normally what is missing would be the start, in a way, whereas this actually tries to work with what's there already. And so the work that they undertook was a series of these smaller projects where each of them had a very different sort of way of operating, where some of them were what they call hosts. They had a strategy with things like green routes, wayfinding, host spaces, and then release spaces, temporary enhancements, green links, green routes. And so this also goes back to something that's that's a reasonably common urban design thing about having a series of different strategies that work together. But you can see in a way how each of them is very different in terms of what it's trying to do. Some of them, you can see here, some of this is actually all about existing furniture. And indeed, one of the things that they do, and the first thing that they probably do, is that they work with the first thing they do is that they work on decluttering the street. And so here's a kind of inventory of all the stuff that's in the street. And then what they do is they do a process of converging all of that stuff into that, converging all of that stuff into that, converging all of that stuff into that. And so what they're doing is, the term they like to use is they're making space in Dalston by literally uncovering and physically making space on the ground. One of the spaces that's probably, and part of this, and if we go through this, you can see how all of those were working. Here's the range of different sorts of strategies they had. They've got some key spaces, but a lot of the time they're working on these, as they call these, release spaces that are interspersed along roads, so opening and releasing. Host spaces, which are presumably about staying. Green routes, which are about moving. Semi-public spaces, and cultural programming, which is a really important part. Now, and so when you look at what's produced, it's quite interesting. So one of the spaces here is called Gillette Square, which is one of the host spaces. And what you can see here is that they created a small space, which is the space that's at the back here with these trees. And then they have this container of equipment. And you can see how that container there, and obviously, we know containers are really topical, but they were probably less so in 2007. And so, this container had inside it a whole range of activities that could be unpacked into the street. And so a lot of those projects worked in that way. Similarly, they're working a lot on wayfinding. And so there was a lot of, around the street a lot of the time, was these signage activities that were about engaging the user in real time, which were about, in a way, your movement once you've decluttered the street to allow clearer wayfinding, for allow people to find spaces, etc. Other projects, were art installations as part of this, and this is, one of my favourite projects up there, which is, a sort of like a, they're also a practice of artists as well as architects, and so there's also a series of these small interventions through there. And then, in leftover spaces like this, there are what we might call formal sort of design projects. This is one, the Dalston Eastern Curve, and in the Eastern Curve, it was an old railway allotment or railway easement that had not had anything happening in it, and so it was temporarily reoccupied as a communal landscape with artworks, etc. inside it. Now, in a way, what you're also talking about here is things that arise through the influence of other things. And so when Muff talks about cultural programming, they also were involved in facilitating opportunities around that were happening. And so it's not like it was happening on its own. And so when they talk about nurturing the possible, one of the clearest examples that I saw at that time was, for example, how this area was linked into the canal network of London. And so essentially what was also happening was through forces that were happening in the city around real estate, people were more and more starting to live on canals. And so we have, bookshops on canals, temporary installations. Similarly, we had things popping up in the area around those projects of Liza's and Joe's, such as they would broker with people, for example, to put venues on roofs, to fix up sidewalks, to create spaces, and other things started to arise. And so one place that I saw in this series of projects was called, the farm, and all of it was, it was hydroponically grown food, grow fish in tanks, the water going into water, and etc., etc. So a really wide range of things. And in London, more generally, there was a lot of this going on. Another thing that was quite amazing that I saw at that time, which I was really impressed with, was this is called a folly for a flyover. And so as part of what they were doing in their approach, they were counterpointing the kind of brutalism of infrastructure with these very organic and traditional kind of, or almost surreal elements. And so this was made by Joe Gibbons' staff and as part of a kind of competition, and they created this sort of little house and bar out of scaffold, which they then connected this fake facade to create a temporary bar, etc. Now, one of the key points of cultural programming that they were doing, and this is another project of theirs that was more focused on cultural programming, was they created this manifesto for the future of artists in Hackney, Wick, and Fish Island. And you can see here that they were saying to determine the necessary conditions for creativity, formalised as council policy, council planning and regeneration policy. Ensure the presence of artists. Ensure that art is the defining characteristic of the neighbourhood. And all of these serious sort of things about trying to maintain it in the space of gentrification, because obviously as you do these projects, you change real estate value, and the artists who've been able to inhabit those places after the communities that often moved out because they got priced out, the next people to come were often artists. And so what happens then is, how does one maintain a community that moved into the area because places were opening up to change? And so they had this thing while I was there, which was very cool, which was a party that was called Hackney Wicked. And in Hackney Wicked, basically, it was a sort of festival of that area, and there were a series of sort of night parties operating in that area. And more, a lot of this stuff was happening in London at the same time as this. So that, for example, this is another place called Urban Physic Garden, which is on a temporary site in London where they grew medicinal plants, etc. Now, the reason it's a kind of weird thing to go from this point here to end up in this point here, but what I'm plotting is a transition from conventional design as form to one which is entirely contingent on one-to-one real-time process. And so, for instance, in the Urban Physic Garden, there probably was never a drawing of this. This was actually a series of things that were built on site. And so if we think about our agency as designers, we have to be all operating in a different way. And so the relationship to form changes when we're making it, because when we're making it in relationship to our perception of what needs to be done right now. It's a totally different way of doing things that also has a totally different procurement framework. For example, undertaking something like this, for example, is about structuring a site in relationship perhaps to an idea about how it might work, but then after that perhaps about cutting it up, getting rid of it and changing it on the basis of what is found. And so the work is in the continuum of the time of the place. And this is the time of Bergson's sense of memory, because another side of this process is that, and the feedback loops we're looking at, is the taking back in of learning from sites and then changing and modifying the site on the basis of things that have arisen from communities, things that have arisen through events. But with that is the requirement of the designer being in the space of the project with the agency to undertake what happens. And this is a change of a way we understand what form is, because form is contingent upon its effects in relationship to change. And I think I might leave that at that. Let me just shut this down.